This is kind of a continuation of yesterday morning's video. I had other things to do earlier, and so I couldn't do it in the morning as usual, and I figure, well, it doesn't hurt to do one later in the day because there are some people who can't make morning ones, especially since I tend to start fairly early. And the video of the other day was, of course, about the religion of the powers that be being what is loosely called New Age and is in fact Theosophy, Luciferianism, Gnosticism, now being touted in the West as quantum physics and that sort of thing. And I wanted to just kind of flesh that out a little bit with this article I wrote this morning in one of my blogs. And it's, I think I linked to it. No, I didn't link to it in the description. I probably will forget, so I'm just going to put it in the chat. But it's at my What in the World site. And the question is about how you know what you know. That's what epistemology means. And how anything can be called objective or a self-evident truth. And you can see with the disclaimer there that I myself have no doubts about what the truth is, and it's my personal conviction, but anybody's personal conviction is still not a proof of anything. And I want to go into some of the terminology of logic and reasoning itself, because if you understand that, then you can understand why people can't see eye to eye on so many things and why everybody wonders how other people can not see what they see. And so, as you can see here, epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. And in my opinion, there's two ways to look at how people decide what is true or what they can use to figure out what's true. There's the rational approach, the logical, order, discipline thinking approach. And there's different kinds of logical approaches to solving a problem. One is deductive reasoning, which is top down, and there's a link there for an article that you can read more of the details. It really does get complicated and involved. So, but I didn't want to repeat all that. I don't intend this to be a long video. And basically it says that if all the premises or points in an argument are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's deductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, it's bottom up. You take what is observed and then reason up from there to try to come to a general explanation. And then there's abductive reasoning, which is basically Occam's razor, where you take a number of possible explanations of the inductive approach and then try to figure out which one is the simplest solution. Now, opposed to that sort of approach is irrationality. I mean, if it isn't rational, it must be irrational. This has a name. It's called solipsism, which essentially says that the only sure thing that you can know is what's in your own mind. And this, if you look up the definition, this isn't what I made up. It is ego and narcissism. That's the essence of solipsism, which means that you are the center of truths. So there couldn't be anything more ego-satisfying, egotistical, or narcissistic than to believe that you are the source of all truth. And that's what solipsism is. And so, but this is not to say they never use logic or reasoning. They just limit it to a very small sphere. So it's bound by the person's predetermined facts that leads to a foregone conclusion. So you choose this approach and you choose what you believe to be true, and then within that you can only use logic insofar as it reaches the conclusions within the bounds of your personal idea of what truth is. So we have two very different approaches to finding truth or fact, and yet both of them ultimately depend on a foundation that can never be truly objective, because we're humans and we're limited. And even, as I say here, the most logical approach has to presume subjectively, which means just so, that we accurately perceive reality and that our reasoning process is sound. That's an assumption. That's something we can't prove. It seems reasonable to a lot of people, but you still can't prove it. So the difference between these two, rational and irrational, is just a matter of degree and not kind. So objectivity is then defined as a widely held assumption, whereas subjectivity is very narrow to the individual. In other words, just the difference in scope, because all the difference really is how many people agree to a certain set of axioms or foundational assumptions. For solipsism, it's one person. For logic and rationalism, it's a lot of people, even a majority, which doesn't make it right. It's just the difference in the definitions. So it would seem obvious then that individuals from opposite approaches will never agree on what truth is or how to find it. And that's a really key point, because if you're talking to someone who is using the solipsism approach and you're using the rational approach, the logic approach, you will never agree on anything. And conversely, if you're trying to talk about some topic with the person and they predictably don't agree with you, you can't say there's something wrong with them. But people do that all the time. They do that both directions. The solipsist will tell the rationalists that they are missing something and wrong, and et cetera, and vice versa. So especially when it comes to the Bible and Christian faith, for example, disputes will never be resolved. And this is within Christianity. There are people who take the allegorical approach. I've talked about that before. You can never resolve those things. That's what I went over in that dependencies video a long time ago. You can never resolve your disagreements if you're using two different approaches. So if you've got one paradigm that says the literal, historical, grammatical approach that I use, and then someone else says, no, it's all a moral lesson, you might as well give up trying to talk together about anything. So, and yet what people do is call the other side wrong, stupid, limited, and nefarious, which is evil intent. All we can really say is that we're all human and fallible. And that's, like I said, just within Christianity. But outside of it, since the Bible, as I've mentioned before, is a Christian text, because Judaism is only New Testament or Tanakh, the whole Bible, Old and New Testaments, is a Christian text. Therefore, no non-Christians can declare our interpretations invalid. And like I said, even within our interpretations, there's Christians who use the literal approach, and there's Christians who use the allegorical approach. And they're not going to reach agreement. But outsiders can't tell us which is right and which is wrong. And a lot of times they appeal to popularity. That's a fallacy. Appeal to authority, appeal to pity. None of those things can override whatever is objectively true, which of course only God can know what's objectively true, because only God is really objective. Because he made all of existence, therefore he knows what's true and what isn't, because it's defined by what his will is. So it follows that anyone who uses the irrational approach cannot violate their own paradigm by using objectivity in order to declare others wrong and their paradigm debunked. In other words, if a person is a solipsist, they can never declare anyone else wrong. And yet they do it all the time. We run into this on a daily basis where people will say, truth is whatever it is to me, and you're wrong. Those two statements are hopelessly in conflict. They're a double standard. They're hypocritical, because if you don't believe that truth is objective, then how can you disagree with anyone? You can only say what's true for you. You can't say what's true for someone else, and you can't be upset with them for not accepting your personal truth. But they do it all the time. So, and I wrote down 7 things that I observed about the Christian faith and why I would pick this over some other faith. And of course, you can see by the way I lay this out that I'm using logical reasoning. I think it would more fit the inductive approach. And what I say is, point 1, you can see there, Jesus is the one and only name that triggers irrational hatred among non-Christians. We see this all the time. You can say Buddha or Krishna or Thor or anything you want, but if you say Jesus, then people get all upset about ramming your beliefs down their throat or whatever it is. Point 2, the Bible is the one and only book that is relentlessly critiqued and held to standards no other book is held. We've seen that over and over. I've done a bunch of videos on it. You won't find any sites dedicated to tearing apart the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas or the Quran very much anymore, except for Christians. Atheists and anti-religious types generally don't bother with those books. They don't care whether anyone is a good Hindu. They only care whether anyone is a bad Christian. So there's, the singling out again. Point 3, the accounts in the Bible are at least as reasonable as stories from any other belief system, including naturalism. That is to say that people can't say the Bible's stories are silly or unbelievable or fairy tales when they themselves believe fairy tales, such as Big Bang cosmology, which is essentially a belief in magic that answers no questions at all. It merely moves the goalposts back to places and times that no one can apply the scientific method, and they want us to accept those things by faith, pure faith. And whether they can use math formulas to construct their imaginary scenario is beside the point. Mathematics does not prove anything in reality. So it's a faith, just like anything else. And the story I find absolutely ridiculous. So also is infinite regression, that goes along with that, because whatever exists had to have been caused by something else and something before that and before that. That's infinite regression, and it answers no questions whatsoever. So when it comes to comparing what the Bible teaches to what any other religion teaches, the Bible certainly holds its own. There are people who believe that things just order themselves, whether it's Big Bang cosmology or some spirituality. They just believe things are in an endless regression cycle, past and future, I guess you could say. And that they think is a superior story to the one that God created us, we messed it up, he stooped down to help us and died and rose again. I mean, how bad is that story compared to all the others? It really isn't by any rational standard. But here again, I said rational. Number 4, syncretistic spirituality is the religion of the powers that be, as I mentioned before. And I have a link here to my video that I did yesterday on syncretism. And that just simply means the buffet approach, where you take bits and pieces of other religions and roll them all together and make up something of your own truth, your solipsism, your religion of you. There are people who call themselves by their own name as an ism, and that's solipsism. It's their particular instance. The word instance is a programming term, as when you have a class or a prepackaged set of code that you include in other code that does a certain thing and is a handy collection of functions, and is called a class. And when you activate that class in your program, it's an instance. And that's the way I see, as a programmer, the way I see solipsism, because each individual ism, which is part of the definition, if you have your own truth, then you are making an instance of solipsism. So your particular application of solipsism is your personal truth, and that is the religion of the powers that be. That is their teaching, their track to godhood teaching, which comes right out of the Garden of Eden. So, the temptation of the serpent against Eve. And so that's their religion. So you might want to, anybody in particular might want to ask themselves why it is that the religion being touted as against the powers that be is their religion. It doesn't make any sense at all. How can how can quote unquote New Age be toppling the powers that be when they made it up? So we have to know what that is. And like I say, you can get more details about their religion by yesterday's video. And this, I said, is kind of just tying the loose ends together on that. So let me go down to number 6 here, where the Bible's content proves it is not written by the powers that be, because, as I've said many times before, it's not the sort of book that any of them would write. Most people who think it came from the Romans or the Jesuits, who didn't even exist when the Bible was written, don't read it themselves in context. They get snippets from sites like evilbible.com and so forth. And the Bible's content is such that God does the opposite of what people would have done. For example, he creates a world where both male and female are equally given dominion over the earth, whereas almost all other religions have by the majority, male rule over female, and by a minority, female over male, and goddess and Sophia and all that sort of, the goddess Sophia, wisdom, the Greek word for wisdom, but and that is kind of Gnostic in a way, and it's one of the teachings that the New Testament was countering when Paul wrote against that sort of thing, why he referred to Adam and Eve and the order of creation. It had to do with that, not with a hierarchy. It had to do with false teachings. And in fact, the opposite of the false teaching is not that, not just that man was created first, but that both were given equal authority. And so that's not the sort of thing anybody in those times would have written. Another thing they would not write is that anytime God intervened in human history, in spite of the fact that we messed up the world ourselves by handing it to Satan, he would choose the young over the old, the weak over the strong, the obscure over the famous, etc. He always picked the least likely candidate to do some particular thing. And it's just like even with Jesus, he picked the little town of Nazareth that was not very well regarded for Jesus to be from. And, Jesus' parents were not rich. Jesus hung around with the dregs of society for the most part. And, this was the one, he did not come in on a white steed already conquering, which is why a lot of the Jews rejected him, because they thought that was the next thing in line, but they weren't paying attention, most of them. And so that's God's habit in history. And why would the Jews, or anyone else for that matter, but especially the Jews, write the Old Testament in such a way that makes them look faithless, stubborn, just incorrigible in general? They saw miracles with their own eyes and then turned from them at the drop of a hat. So the Jews would not make that up, okay? And in the New Testament, who would make up any of the things Jesus said or did? If they would have had him come as a conquering king. If the Jews were making him up, they would have done that. If the Romans or Greeks were making it up, they would have done something similar and made him to be some military leader, and would not have mentioned women at all, most likely, whereas Jesus was kind to women. He had, Mary's sister of Martha and Lazarus sitting at his feet as a rabbinical student would do. He used women as object lessons in what the kingdom of God was like. Women were the only ones who stuck by him right to the end at the cross, and they were the first to be told the good news that he had arisen. They were the first to see him. Greeks and Romans and Jews would not write that. And the disciples would not make that up because they are portrayed as thick-headed, cowardly, faithless. I mean, if you look at the New Testament, that's how they're portrayed, especially in the Gospels and Acts. Jesus and Paul and these people were tearing their hair out half the time because of their followers. So who would make up this story? It's like Charles Wesley, I think I have a quote of his on my main website, where he says, the Bible was not written by good people because good people would not lie and say, thus saith the Lord. And it wasn't written by bad people because bad people will not condemn themselves. I mean, the Bible condemns liars, it condemns murderers, it condemns thieves, it condemns extortionists, and these are the kind of people that would not write a book that condemns them. Why would they do that? So the content of the Bible, even today, even if it's supposedly been tampered with, is not the kind of book anybody would make up, especially not the powers that be or the Jesuits or the Jews or anybody else. So by its content, we know who didn't write it. And that's the book that everybody is thinking, oh, this is the book that the powers that be wrote, and they're following the script, and so we should discard the Bible, where they're falling right into the big powers that be trap when they do that. And point 7, all false religion stems from the fallen ones, Gnosticism, Luciferianism, and was formalized in ancient Babylon. And I have a link here to my video on Babylon. So those are my observations about using the rational approach if I were to pick, applying it to find the truth about our world and our creator and so forth. And so it seems to me, I conclude from these things that it's highly probable. I can't prove it, but I can deduce it or induce it, as the case may be, that it seems the most reasonable, rational conclusion to draw that the Bible is the Word of God and literally true. And because it is, then Jesus is God in human flesh who died and rose again, and that if we accept this as a truth or in fact, we can be reconciled to our Creator and adopted as God's own children. And this is the Jesus who said he is the truth. So we have a choice whether to accept that or reject it. And based upon the application of logic and reason, it seems to me that this is the best conclusion to draw. It's the simplest, too. A lot of people have to jump through many ever more complicated hoops in order to make some other approach work on the Bible because as, for example, I've used an example before, Michael Heiser, who is an expert on ancient Semitic languages and cultures and has done a lot of good videos on the Nephilim. He takes the allegorical approach to the Bible. And he is, in spite of the fact that he doesn't believe either of those things, he believes that if you're consistent in a literal approach, then you have to not only believe the Bible teaches young earth creationism, but that it also teaches that the world is flat and stationary. And he rejects both of those. He puts science above the Bible, science which is changing on a daily basis. And he realized at one point in an article I can no longer find that on his blog that this painted him into a corner, a really big one, because if these things are allegories, if all of the Bible is to be taken as a moral lesson, then Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. And then he's left with an empty philosophy, then you might as well pick one that doesn't come with as much persecution. So that's where an allegorical, spiritualized approach to the Bible goes. That doesn't mean the literal method doesn't use spirituality, and then nothing can be farther from the truth. I mean, this is the basis for our faith. This is what and who we have faith in. And because it's rational, because we have eyewitnesses, and eyewitnesses only matter if you're using the logical, rational approach, then we can use the Bible as an anchor or guiding compass when we're looking for truth. And that's been the whole point of this article, was how do you look for truth? How do you find it? Most people rush off blindly without a compass or any kind of way of determining what's true and false other than their own personal preferences and what feels right at the time. You're never going to find anything that way. You have to have some kind of compass, and in order to have one, you have to assume certain things about the world and your reality in this realm. And like I said, when I apply the logical, reasonable, rational approach to the Bible and to truth in general, this is where I wind up. And because Jesus is truth, then I can trust everything he says. And so that's where truth comes from. And anything that doesn't match by definition is not true. So if that's the case, then every idea or philosophy or truth claim that opposes must be false by definition, as I wrote here. And those whose paradigm is irrational cannot declare this statement to be false, hateful, narrow, bigoted, offensive, stupid, or limiting to humanity. Here again is where solipsism contradicts itself and undermines itself, because if all truth is a person's subjective choice and nothing more, then how can they say that some other approach is wrong? They can't without violating their own teachings. So whenever they say these things, they tell us that we're bad because we believe we're right and everyone else is wrong. Well, so do they, on an even greater scale than we do, because we at least appeal to other people and to general principles that we apply whether we like them or not, the results or not. We believe in the principles, and we trust our compass. And so we measure everything by that. And because we do, sometimes it'll lead us to places we didn't thought we'd wind up, and so be it. We accept that. But people who believe that truth is what they personally believe it to be and there's nothing objective, for them to turn around and say someone else's method or truth is wrong is self-defeating. It's hypocritical. So here again, this is why I said here at the end of my document, belief that truth is different for each individual is the most narrow and self-absorbed belief of all, since such a person declares themselves right and every other person in existence wrong. It's extremely narrow and egotistical to believe that your truth is your own. and that there's no such thing as objectivity, because you literally believe you, in all of humanity, in all of history, is right and everyone else is wrong. And that's way more narrow than anything Christianity teaches. And of course, it was very narrow, as I mentioned earlier, for Jesus to say he is the truth and no one comes to the Father but through him. That's really narrow. So here again, when people we run into all the time in conspiracy realm will say that you have to, one way or another, separate your mind from your conscious thought from truth, because the mind is an obstacle, as I went into detail yesterday. They're contradicting themselves, and their reaction to the objective literal approach, and especially to the name of Jesus in the Bible, their reactions really say it all, because they're showing, no matter what their words are, their actions are showing what they really believe, which is that they just hate the Bible and Christianity, because they don't get this ballistic when, if you were to say, for example, that you believe that the Hindu Vedas are the ultimate truth, and they're like, oh, that's cool, I just disagree. But if you say the Bible is the only truth, no, you're this horrible, backward, racist, whatever. And it's so hypocritical, I don't know how anyone can't see it. But then, I use the rational approach. And so I guess it doesn't matter to them if they have a double standard. They're cool with that, because to them, they are the standard. And if you don't meet up, then there's something wrong with you. And again, this is very egotistical and narcissistic. So I don't see the point in trying to reason with people who don't use reason. It's really an exercise in futility. And it's, there's just nothing you can say to someone who uses their own feelings as the measure of truth. What can you say? And it's just a waste of time to try. And if they use a hybrid, which a lot of them wind up doing, which just as Christians, some use the allegorical approach when it's convenient and the literal approach when it's convenient. It's inconsistent, and for both the Christians that do that and the non-Christians that do that, then you're just going to be like a cat chasing a laser dot all day long. It's 1 minute there's one rule applying, and the next minute there's another rule applying, and then here again you have no compass. So if you're not consistent, you have no compass, even within your approach, whichever one of those two you choose. So I just wanted to tie up those loose ends from yesterday that it seemed like I needed to add just a little bit more. And we just have to choose our battles, because, like I said, if you understand these two approaches, you either can agree on a widely held set of principles of logic and reasoning, or everybody's on their own and nothing is truly knowable, which itself is contradictory, because that's a statement of knowing, to know nothing is knowable. There's just no way around it. And here again, though, we have to understand that even the most rational, widely held logical approach is still based upon an opinion that this approach is the thing to do. But whatever you choose, be consistent. And then if you're talking to somebody who's in the opposite paradigm, just understand that you're not going to get anywhere. It's inevitable. It's just the nature of each different paradigm. They can't meet, they can't blend. And when people try, they just wind up being a solipsist in the end anyway. So either one, people choose, but let's try not to disregard these differences, because it can save you an awful lot of grief. And I think that's all I really had to say. And I was hoping some other people, not to say I'm glad that you guys showed up in chat. I was just hoping to see more faces, just because it's a different time of day. I know there's other hangouts that are probably running. I didn't even really check much, but the point is, I get the same number of viewers no matter when I run, so it doesn't matter. And the people who go to the other channels aren't likely to come here anyway, because they're solipsists. They don't care what objectivity is. They want to use part of it and not all of it, because in the end, it's whatever they decide must be true. And there's no consistent methodology, no consistently reading compass. It's like Captain Jack Sparrow's compass in Pirates of the Caribbean, where it only pointed to whatever he wanted most. That's pretty much a good illustration of solipsism, which, as I said, if you're not consistent in any of these approaches, you are a solipsist. And you've got Captain Jack Sparrow's compass. Whereas if you have one that points to one thing all the time, like a regular compass, then at least, you know, notwithstanding all the variables, but as magnetic fields go. But the point is, a compass that only points to what you want is solipsism. A compass that always points to north, no matter who holds it, is the rational approach. And I think it's a decent approach. It has, it seems to be less narcissistic and less egotistical, because you have to humble yourself when you find things that don't fit your paradigm. So it at least has that advantage. So I think that, if I had to choose one, just as objectively as I can possibly be, that would be it. Yeah, that's a good verse, Proverbs 3:5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. And everything you do, I think it goes on to say, man, it's been a long, I used to have that memorized. And he will guide your steps or something. I'm missing a line, but yeah, it's a guide and a light, etc. You can't read the Bible without being told that. And the Bible is internally consistent. There are people who think otherwise, but I would challenge that claim. But yeah, let's see in the chat. A new gospel of the truther. Walking with God, and he will surely guide me. Yeah, I mean, I think Jesus proved that by rising from the dead. I mean, who else are we going to follow? I have never in all these years found another way, another compass that does better. I don't think there's anything to lose by going this way. Now, some people would say that's something called Pascal's wager, where you just say, it's a safer bet. But this isn't about just having a safe bet. It's about what is true and how you're going to find it. And in the end, if you go far enough down the philosophical road, you'll find that everything, no matter what you would choose, is based upon opinion at some point, but that in practical terms, there is enough objectivity possible that I think if we apply it consistently, we will find out that the Bible is true and Jesus did rise from the dead and he is coming back, and we're being offered adoption as his children, and that there's this really huge, unimaginably awesome advantage to that. So, yeah, that's the next verse. Thanks. So I think that's all I had to say. I did want it to be a short hangout, and I think it will be. So there you go. Next time I'll have something to say. I'll let you know. I'm expecting to be busy off and on tomorrow. Not sure about the weekend, but I usually don't do hangouts on the weekend anyway. So, all right. Thanks everybody for coming. And if for no other reason than it might be helpful to pass around this link and the one to the previous video about whose religion the powers that be are pushing, it's their religion, and that this is the Luciferian doctrine, etc. And that if we keep these two kinds of reasoning clear, we can do a better job of bypassing conversations that are just a waste of time. So yeah, it would be very nice if the rapture happened. And I briefly mentioned that at the end of yesterday's video. There are no signs for the rapture. The rapture is for the church, not for Israel. All the signs are for Israel, but that doesn't mean that the rapture can't happen on a day of a Jewish sign. But we have to also remember that a sign points to something ahead, not to something that's right here most of the time. I mean, there may be an end sign that, turn here, this is the spot. But most signs are before that. Whether this one coming up in a few days is the sign that says we're here, who can say? That would be awfully nice. Would solve a lot of problems. But here again, the most important thing is to use that as our motivation to spread the gospel and keep our focus where it belongs, and to Also remember that more important than what shape the Earth is who made it. And you're going to need stuff like this to say who made it. First, I would even put this one first to say, how do you know what you know? And then is the person you're talking to a solipsist or not? Even an inconsistent one, which inconsistency, again, is solipsism, because by not being consistent, you are following a very crooked and inconsistent, variable path. And then the other one, the previous video, would be details on how exactly Gnosticism, Luciferianism is the religion of the powers that be. It is being sold in the West as New Age. And so we cannot fight the powers that be with their own religion. It just isn't going to work. So, yeah, keep your eyes peeled, keep as busy as possible because the time's short. And we'll see y'all later, unless the rapture happens. That would be awesome. That would be the best reason ever for not seeing you again. So, all right, take care.